I still remember the first time I heard about that plane. We were at the height of World War II, and the skies over Europe were the stage for a relentless duel between technology and courage. On one side, the Luftwaffe, with its sharp machines, designed with almost surgical precision. On the other, the Allied forces, fighting with everything they had to regain air superiority. It was in this scenario that a German fighter, unlike anything we had ever faced, fell into our hands. The news spread quickly among the American bases. A nearly intact example of an enemy aircraft had been captured. No one knew for sure how it had happened. Some said the German pilot had gotten lost, others that a malfunction had forced him to land in Allied-controlled territory. What mattered, however, was what we had before us, a masterpiece of German engineering. It was as if we had gotten our hands on an enemy secret, something that could change the course of the war. When the aircraft was transported to the analysis base, I remember the almost reverent silence of the engineers and mechanics surrounding it. It was the Messerschmitt Me 262, the first operational jet fighter in the world. Its sleek fuselage, canted wings, and twin side-mounted engines looked like something from another planet. While we still relied on piston engines, the Germans had made a technological leap years ahead. But that plane, now sitting idle in the American hangar, told a story of ambition and haste. The Me 262 had been designed to dominate the skies, but it arrived too late. It lacked resources, experienced pilots, and fuel. Still, every inch of that aircraft was a lesson in what it meant to think ahead of its time. I remember walking around it, observing every detail, every line, trying to understand what made that fighter so special. It was almost poetic to think that the plane that was born to destroy our bombers now rested under our flag, ready to reveal its secrets. At that moment, few of us imagined how much this discovery would change the future of aviation. The Me 262 would not only be studied, it would be the starting point of a new era. An era in which the sound of propellers would give way to the deafening roar of jet turbines. But that's only the first part of the story. Because what the Americans would do with that unimaginable fighter jet would surpass all expectations. When I started investigating the history behind that plane, I realized it was much more than just a fighter jet. Messerschmitt Me 262, it represented the essence of the German mentality during the Second World War: precision, ambition, and an almost obsessive pursuit of innovation. It was the result of years of research and daring, a project that seemed to defy the very laws of physics of its time. While the Allies were still improving piston engines and conventional propellers, the engineers of Messerschmitt AG, led by Willy Messerschmitt, they were immersed in something completely new: jet propulsion. The idea was simple, yet revolutionary: to replace the combustion system that powered the propellers with a continuous flow of compressed and burned air, capable of generating unprecedented speed. In theory, the concept seemed brilliant. In practice, it was a colossal challenge. The turbines were fragile, required rare materials, and suffered extreme wear. Still, the Germans persisted. And in 1942, when the Me 262 made its first flight, the world of aviation would never be the same. The sound of the turbines breaking the silence of the air was the harbinger of a new era, the beginning of jet dominance. But what impressed me most was the contrast between genius and desperation. The project had been started long before the war reached its critical point, but it was delayed by political decisions. Hitler, obsessed with bombing enemy cities, insisted that the Me 262 be converted into a fast bomber, not just a fighter. This decision delayed its production and, ironically, saved countless Allied lives. Even so, when it finally entered service, the Me 262 was almost invincible. It flew at more than 850 km/h, leaving any Allied fighter behind. Its firepower, consisting of 430 million Malawian Kwacha's 108 cannons, was devastating. A single well-placed shot was enough to destroy a heavy bomber like the B-17. Allied pilots who had the misfortune of encountering it in the air described the sensation as facing a ghost. The Me 262 would appear out of nowhere, pass by like lightning, and disappear before there was time to react. And the most frightening thing is that they knew it was only the beginning, a glimpse of the future. But power has its price. German jets were sensitive machines, difficult to maintain and vulnerable during takeoff and landing. Many were destroyed before even leaving the ground, shot down by Allied fighters that had learned to attack enemy bases before the Me-262s could take to the skies. Still, the psychological impact was immense. Every time a Me-262 appeared on the radar, American pilots knew they were facing something that seemed impossible to overcome. And it was precisely this mixture of fear and fascination that led the United States to make a bold decision to capture one of these planes and study it thoroughly. It was the beginning of a new race, no longer for victory in the war, but for the conquest of the future. And I was there, following every step of this process, witnessing the moment when the enemy became the teacher, and the American student would learn too quickly. It was the year of 1945 and the Nazi Empire was crumbling. Allied forces were advancing across Europe, and the Germans were fighting to maintain what remained of their military infrastructure. Amid the chaos, the Luftwaffe was no longer the feared force it had been at the start of the war. Its pilots were young and inexperienced, and fuel was so scarce that it limited training flights. It was in this context that the opportunity arose. One Me-262, the aircraft, piloted by a German on a reconnaissance mission, suffered an engine failure and was forced to land in an area recently occupied by American troops. The pilot attempted to destroy the plane before being captured, but luck, or perhaps fate, was on the Allied side. The damage was minimal. When we heard the news, it seemed unbelievable. An enemy fighter jet, practically intact, was under our control. I was assigned to accompany the team of technicians and engineers who would transport the aircraft to a safe location. I remember the feeling when I approached it for the first time: silence. Nobody said a word. Only the sound of footsteps and the look of someone who knew they were facing something historic. The plane was carefully disassembled and sent to the base de Wright Field, in Ohio, the heart of American aeronautical research. There, engineers from USAF, United States Army Air Forces, and experts from Boeing, Lockheed and Bell Aircraft, they eagerly awaited the unveiling of its secrets. The project was named Operation Lusty, a secret operation dedicated to capturing and studying German aerial technologies. During the transport, a team of experienced pilots, including the famous Colonel Harold E. Watson, he oversaw every step. They knew that the knowledge hidden within that fighter jet could change everything the United States understood about aviation. And indeed, it changed. When the initial analyses began, the engineers were speechless. The aerodynamics of the Me-262 were so advanced that it seemed to have come from a decade in the future. The wings had a slight angle of deflection, which reduced air resistance at high speeds, a concept virtually unknown among the Allies until then. But what was most striking were the turbine junkers Jumo 004. Even though they were unstable and fragile, they represented a giant leap in air propulsion. For the first time, Americans could see up close how a real rocket worked. Operational jet aircraft. I watched those men, engineers, pilots, scientists, with the same fascination I see in the eyes of someone witnessing an archaeological discovery. They disassembled each piece with surgical precision, making notes, taking photographs, measuring. It was like studying the enemy's DNA to learn from it. The captured Me-262 came to be known as Watson's Whizzer, in honor of the colonel who led the operation. And this would be just the first of many. By the end of the war, dozens of German aircraft had been secretly taken to the United States, including fighters, bombers, and even rocket prototypes. At the time, I didn't fully understand what that meant. But today, looking back, I realized that moment marked the beginning of a new race, the technological race of jet aviation. The world would never be the same after that, and what the Americans would do with that knowledge would transform not only military aviation, but the entire history of flight. I'll never forget the sound of the tools echoing inside the hangar. It was like watching surgery. A group of engineers surrounded the Me-262, carefully disassembling each panel, each screw, as if they were opening the body of a living being. The smell of oil and burnt metal still permeated the air. It was the smell of war, but also of the future. Initial analyses confirmed what many suspected: the Germans had achieved a level of engineering that surpassed anything we had built up to that point. The Me-262 structure was incredibly lightweight, made of metal alloys that balanced strength and speed. The wings, with a sweep angle of 18.5 degrees, allowed the aircraft to cut through the air with less resistance, reaching speeds that Allied fighters could not even dream of. But the real heart of the machine was in the turbine junkers Jumo 004. When American engineers opened the first engine, they fell silent. It was like witnessing the birth of a new era. The internal parts were simple, but the concept was extraordinary, a multi-stage axial compressor that pushed air into a continuous combustion chamber. This allowed for constant propulsion, no propellers, no pistons, just brute force pushing the aircraft to speeds exceeding 850 km/h. However, it was also a compromise. The metal alloys used in the turbines were fragile because the Reich no longer had access to precious metals, such as nickel and chromium, in large quantities. Therefore, the engines had a very short lifespan, approximately 25 hours of flight before they needed to be replaced. That was the price of haste. Despite these limitations, the genius lay in how the Germans had transformed theory into practice. Something that, until then, the Americans had only seen in experiments. And most impressively, the control systems, the onboard instruments, and even the ejection devices were ahead of their time. I remember an engineer from Bell Aircraft, named Robert Stanley, who was observing the cockpit and murmured, "They thought of everything. Even the pilot." He was right. The dashboard layout was compact and ergonomic, something rare for the time. The Me-262 had a partially pressurized cabin, electric power controls, and an automatic weapon system that could adjust firing according to speed. It was a machine built for hunting, and for winning. Reports began piling up on the control desk. Each new discovery seemed like a treasure. The shape of the wings inspired the tests of Bell X-1, the aircraft that years later would break the sound barrier. The airflow control solutions and fuselage design served as the basis for the designs of Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, the first operational American jet fighter. But perhaps the most valuable thing of all was the invisible learning, the knowledge about what not to do. The Americans understood the German mistakes, unstable engines, complex maintenance, and exorbitant costs. And they promised themselves they would do better. As I watched the Me-262 being completely disassembled, piece by piece, I had the feeling that we were unearthing a fossil from the future. It was the enemy unwittingly teaching us how to fly into tomorrow. The sound of the turbine still echoed in my head, and little did we know that, in just a few months, the fruit of this learning would take flight, and take world aviation to a new level. A few months after capturing the first German fighter planes, Wright Field had transformed into a veritable laboratory of ideas. The war wasn't completely over yet, but it was already clear that the future of aviation would be jet-powered. And we Americans were determined to lead this new era. I remember the atmosphere in that hangar, a mixture of euphoria and urgency. The Me-262 had already been disassembled, studied, and reassembled dozens of times. Every detail, every flaw, every virtue had been noted in reports that were now circulating among the largest aeronautical companies in the United States: Lockheed, Bell, Boeing, Republic. It was in this environment that the plan to create an American fighter based on the lessons of the Me-262 was born. Not a copy, but an evolution. The first step was taken by Lockheed, with the Project XP-80 Shooting Star, which was already under development, but which was radically improved after studying German aircraft. I remember watching the engineers comparing schematics. They looked at the Me-262 design and figured out what worked, and what needed fixing. The positioning of the turbines, for example, was a dilemma. The Germans had mounted both on the sides of the fuselage, a practical solution, but one that created instability in abrupt maneuvers. The Americans opted to place the engine on the center of the fuselage, a change that improved balance and aerodynamics. Another crucial adaptation was in the materials. German turbines suffered rapid wear due to a shortage of heat-resistant alloys. In the United States, engineers replaced these alloys with compounds of nickel and cobalt, creating much more durable engines, capable of flying for hundreds of hours without failure. But what impressed me most was the spirit of collaboration. Civil and military engineers worked side by side, exchanging information at an unprecedented speed. It was as if the entire country had understood, all at once, that it was facing a unique opportunity to transform enemy knowledge into power. It was during this period that I witnessed the birth of the first American prototypes directly inspired by the Me-262. One of them was secretly tested in Muroc, California, now known as Base Area Edwards. The aircraft incorporated several solutions from the German fighter plane, from swept wings to a retractable landing gear system. The result was surprising. The aircraft reached speeds exceeding 800 km/h with much greater stability and control. I still remember the first time I saw that new American jet take off. The sound was similar to that of the Me-262, that deep, continuous roar that made your chest vibrate. But there was something different. The machine seemed more refined, more balanced, more American. What began as a technical study was becoming, before my very eyes, a symbol. The enemy that had tried to destroy freedom had, unknowingly, inspired the breakthrough that would guarantee the United States air superiority in the following decades. And it was there, in that hangar full of papers, open engines, and the smell of kerosene, that I realized something profound. War wasn't won only with weapons, but with learning. And we had learned from the best, even if they were the worst enemies. The Me-262 had ceased to be just a German machine. It had become a bridge to the future, the link between the devastating past and the new era of jet fighters. And the next step would be to put them into the air, to test, prove, and, above all, surpass everything the enemy had created. It was one of those moments when you feel like you're living history in real time. That I was there, on the dry track of Muroc in the California desert, as the sun rose on the horizon and illuminated the silvery body of the new American creation, the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star. It was the direct result of what we learned from the Me-262, an elegant, fast, and, above all, reliable jet. The silence was broken by the sound of the turbines, Allison J-33, which began to spin with a deep roar. The sensation was familiar, but different from the German jet. The American engine was more stable, less prone to failure, and the fuselage gleamed as if it carried the pride of an entire nation. At that moment, I knew we were witnessing the birth of a new era. When the P-80 started rolling down the runway and took off for the first time, I felt the same thrill I felt when I saw the Me-262. But now there was something more. Hope. The plane climbed easily, cutting through the air effortlessly. It was fast, very fast, and, unlike the German jet, it didn't seem to struggle against its own technology. It was stable, docile, controllable. The test pilot, Tony Lovier, he would later say that the plane flew like a thought. During the following weeks, we witnessed a series of intense tests. The P-80 exceeded all expectations, reaching speeds of over 900 km/h. It was the first American fighter truly capable of competing with the Me-262. And, in some ways, it surpassed it in almost every aspect. Each flight was a mixture of nervousness and euphoria. We knew that, we were paving the way for the future. But the P-80 wasn't the only one to benefit from the studies on the German fighter, Bell aircraft. He also delved deeply into the findings of Me-262, applying them to an even more ambitious project, the Bell X-1, the first aircraft to break the sound barrier. The influence was clear: the compact fuselage, the wing shape, the propulsion concept. Everything bore traces of the knowledge gained after the war. And it didn't stop there. From the Republic emerged the F-84 Thunderjet. From North America came the legendary F-86 Sabre, and even the Navy has started testing carrier-based jets, like the McDonnell F-H Phantom. Each of these aircraft carried, in some way, the DNA of the Me-262, that same fighter that, just a few years earlier, had been the terror of European skies. I remember a conversation with one of the younger engineers in the group. He asked me, "Do you think we owe the Germans something for all this?" And I replied, "We owe them what we learned. Nothing more." The war destroyed much, but it also revealed the power of the human mind, and that power doesn't belong to any flag. As testing progressed, the Americans refined control, aerodynamics, and performance techniques that would transform world aviation. The lessons learned from the Me-262 helped not only fighter jets, but also commercial aircraft and future space programs. At the end of that year, looking at the skies over Muroc, with several jets streaking across the horizon, I realized something profound: the echoes of the German turbines had transformed into the symphony of American progress. The enemy had planted the seed, but we were the ones who made it bloom. And that was just the beginning, because what would come next, the influence of this new generation of jets on the Cold War and American air supremacy, would show how much that discovery would forever change the balance of power in the air.